Well, good afternoon, folks. Old Buster coming to you again. I'm sorry, like I said before in another video, I'm sorry I missed a week, but a little under the weather there. So we're going to try to get a few stories ahead a little bit, and you might have two in this week, and you might have to skip a week, but we're going to get back on track here before long. Well, the name of this old story is Crow Creek. Well, y'all folks remember we talked about Crow Creek before, and this is just going to be a little bit more about it. And a lot of people say, oh, there's no such thing as that. Well, maybe not all of it, folks, I understand that. But you remember what I told you, it's all based on truth. Somewhere, somehow, and it has got some truth in it. And where there's smoke, there's fire. So, Walter did a sci-fi down through New Mexico and all down in Arizona and all down in there, and he stayed with them Indians and looked at them for a while too. So some of the things he come up with is what we got in here, and other things people told us, some Indian people we know. Well, let's get on with old Crow Creek. Well, Buster just sit down to a plate full of fried tater cakes, ham and eggs, and a smoked bacon on the side, and homemade grape jelly sandwich on a fresh out of the oven biscuit big as a lard can lid when Walter come in, 'cause he smelt it too. He said howdy to Grandma O and plopped down in a chair at the table. Now Grandpa Gus had done went into town for some parts, and Buster was just a-fixin' to take up bail and have a look-see at the levees after a shower they had the night before. Well, Buster had to make sure there weren't no breaks in the levees to flood the crop. Because what happened, the water come down through there too swift and just wipe all them little plants out that was growing in the water. Well, Grandma asked Walter if he wanted something to eat, and he said he surely would appreciate it. I told you he done smelt it. He done run on up there on us and rode over on old Stony and knowed if he didn't eat nothing, he was in for a fit from Grandma and her wondering what was ailing Walter. Well, then Grandma would call up Miss Ollinger, and boy, then the war was on, and she would be a-waiting with the castor oil. He didn't like that at all. Well, Walter didn't want none of that, I tell you. Well, Grandma knows Walter liked biscuits and gravy, so she whooped up a batch for him and Buster. Well, Buster said since Walter wasn't going to eat, he reckoned he'd better have another half of himself. Now, folks, I know y'all don't believe I used to eat like that. But when I went to Air Corps, they had to give the colonel, the doctor did, to give me fourths of everything. If it was 4 chickens or whatever, ate breakfast at 6 in the morning, 12 at midnight, and then dinner and supper. Of course, no liver, no beets, nothing like that, though. Well, Grandma knows Walter liked biscuits and gravy, so like I say, she whooped him up some, and Buster had him a little bit more of it. And Walter was a-growing a right considerable like then since he got out of high school. And he was about to catch up with Buster in height, but not the heft. He didn't have the weight on him. Walter just wasn't built that way, but was coming on to be a strapping lad, if you know what I mean. Well, after them boys put away a pot of coffee and a gallon of fresh milk between them, Walter told Buster he had to talk to him about something important like. Walter told Buster he done had one of them epiphanies, like Hire done, and had it get a hold of him and sure got him to thinking about all things. Well, first off, he done had a dream about Crow Creek, and the boys had to get on back out there. Now, Julian and Leonard's kin come to him in a spirit dream the other night, and he kept seeing them for 3 nights running now. The dog soldiers and Julian and the Indians at the Snake Lodge was there too, telling him to gather up the boys and get on back out there, but he didn't know why. Well, Julian told him in due time, but all of the boys had to go. Now, there was the problem. Buster could get a loose, and so could Hired. Alma May knowed Hired would go with the boys no matter what, and Lou Ann would fuss a mite with their young'un on the way, but would kick him in the backside of his and britches and tell him don't be long in coming home. Of course, she'd make Walter pucker up and tell him to be careful like, too, no. Well, all the folks knowed the boys had been on too many adventures not to let them go. Well, Jesse was the problem. He was in the law school at the University of Alabama and got tangled up with that black-hated gal. She was highfalutin with 3 sisters from Selma. It was kind of like they was thrown together at the schoolhouse and was always in each other's face. Well, Jessie had done got over Denise, and Bebe was doing her thing with the presidential court, but Monique still had an eye dead set on Jessie. She didn't press him none, but was there waiting, and Jessie knowed that. But knowing Jessie, he was all business and just didn't have no time for courting at this time in his life at the law school, being a lawyer and all. Now that black-hated gal had her cap set for Jessie, and just to suit her own purposes only. Old Jessie had him a nickel or two, as did the other boys, and she wanted every dime of his'n and anybody else that she could get her hands on. Well, her people weren't no better either. Them folks, they was quite, well, let me say, if you, well, let me say this about, they weren't no friends. They was enemies. Well, Jessie wasn't easy to snocker, but this time he got sold a bill of goods. Walter was wondering how in the world they was going to get Jessie away from the schoolhouse and the clutches of that black-hated gal. Well, Buster said he'd study on old Cuz there for a spell and could come up with something. Well, Buster was still a sporting Lulu, and she didn't put no demands on him neither, and that gal was smart as a tack too, I tell you. She would always jump right on into anything if and Buster wanted her to, and Buster thought he would gather up all the boys and the gals up together to figure on this to get Jessie loose from Tuscaloosa. Now, Jessie could be a mite stubborn on occasion, you know, and he just might have to get Jessie's ma and pa in on this one. Fact is, he just might do that, he told Walter. Well, Buster got them all together and told the boys and the gals along with Jessie's folks what all was a-happening there at the schoolhouse with Jessie. He was in a pickle and he didn't even know it. Jessie was plumb clueless when it come to women sometimes, even though them pheromones was a-running crazy. Well, Jessie's ma said she sure hated to deceive Jessie, so 'tweren't gonna be no lie telling, but she had an idea. Now, Mr. McBrayer was going to be in the hospital for his tonsils to be took out, seeing as he ain't never had that done when he was a little tyke. She was going to tell Jessie she needed him at home for a bit to see his and Pop. Now, that weren't no lie, but it just wasn't going to be till the boys got back from the Crow Creek. Mr. McBrayer was going to hold off till then for his operation. Buster and the boys were going to fly on down to Tuscaloosa in the Queen and pick him up and then take him on back when he wasn't needed no more at home. Now, all that was true for sure now, just not in Jessie's timetable though. Well, in the meantime, the gals were going to sashay on down to Selma for a little trip and try to get the goods on this here black-hated gal and her sisters and her people. There was money enough for a private investigator kind of feller if they needed it, but the gals was chomping at the bit to get in on the action. Now, Buster and Walter and Hired was going to have everything arranged when they got on into Vernal, so not to have to try to get things together at the last minute. Excuse me, folks. Now, you know Vernal is where they had that place up there they bought, and it's right there on the line of Utah and Colorado by Ashley National Park. And all kinds of going-ons up there. But anyhow, that's where all this took place. And that's a true place now. And there's facts, you can look it up on the internet or anything you want to. There's facts about that place up in there. Skinwalker and everything else. Well, Jessie's ma called him up and told him he was needed at home. Jessie put up a little fuss, but sure enough was going to do what all his and ma said to do. Now, Ms. McBrayer said it weren't going to be for long, and then he could get on back to the schoolhouse. She told Jessie that Buster and the boys would fly up in the Queen and get him so that save some time. She said they would be up on a Sunday afternoon. Well, when the boys got there, Jessie was packed up, not too happy, though, about leaving school right then. You know, he gets right fractious about that stuff when he gets, dead centered on something. Well, Jesse always had something going on in his mind, and it surely had to do with business or schooling. The boys see that black-headed gal when he come up to the plane. Her and her sisters brung Jesse to the airport right next to the schoolhouse, and to tell the truth, she was a pretty good-looking gal and built up right smart too. But you could just tell she used all them so-called feminine wiles of hers to her best advantage. The little perky sister seemed like a fair enough person, but you just couldn't tell from how they was a-acting. Well, the boys never seen such a show as put on when Jesse was a-leaving. They was worser than 2 for a penny egg-sucking hound dogs so's it would gag a gopher. Plumb pitiful-like. Now, how Jesse fell into that trap, they'd never know. Boy, howdy, they sure needed Monique up here and pronto. Now, Jesse piled into the Queen in the back, and Hired did the flying. Walter was beside Jesse and got to telling him about his dream. Well, Jesse told Walter he ought to go if he felt that strong about it. Well, Walter said he was right glad to hear Jesse say that, and asked Hired and Buster if they felt that way too. Well, they said sure shooting, and then Buster piped up and told Hired to head to Queen West. Ha! Lord, them boys, I'm gonna tell you, they're best. Now, Jesse said he didn't mean that he could go, but they could. Walter said they all had to go, or it wasn't gonna be right with Julian and the dog soldiers. Well, Jesse said he wasn't gonna go, but all 3 of the boys said he didn't have no say. He was outvoted. Well, Jesse was a fuming, I'm a-telling you, folks. He hollered to him that he had to see his and Pa. Well, Buster said, now, cuz, your Pa said the doctor said he could wait till we got back and then you could help tend to him. Well, old Jesse was a spitting fire, I tell you. What about my schooling and business I got to tend to? Well, Hired said, Jesse, it'll wait to end the conversation. That's what Hired told Jesse, you see. And of course he was flying, and ain't nothing he gonna do to get him to change his mind. The boys all knowed once that Jesse got into the fray, he'd change his mind, but that dang black-hated witch, believe her name was Janice or something like that, had done deviled Jesse up something terrible like. Them sisters was a-helping her too, just a-prodding everything along. Now that Jesse was a-sporting the gal, what I mean, not that because he wasn't sporting her at all, I can tell you that for a fact. But she had her hooks in to him deep, too deep it seemed. The boys were going to fix that come hell and high water, cause they knowed the good Lord was a-willing and the creek wasn't going to rise, leastways not yet. Well, Buster told Jesse that he had a new job, and Jesse was all huffed up and all, and asked what was that. That's what he said. Just what was that now, Buster? Buster said he had a brand new position. Senior Executive Assistant. Who's that? What's that? Fur asked Jesse. I was hired by Southern Natural Gas by Mr. Jesse McBrayer Sr. for Jesse McBrayer Jr. For Pete's sake, said Jesse, what's all that about? Well, Buster said his main job was to say one word. What's that? No! And he was going to be Jesse's new roommate at Alabama. Ha! Ha! Of course, that'd be hard put for Buster to leave Arkansas, but he'd go there if he had to. Now, Jesse was fit to be tied, I tell you, and the boys was just a-howling and laughing like I'm laughing now, 'cause I can see it all now. Ain't no way out for Jesse, said Hired. Buster is just too big. He'll sit on you and you'll be in cousins and all. Now family's involved. Well, Jesse said his and Paul couldn't hire nobody for him because he didn't have the say. Buster said, I reckon he does, since him and me is major stockholders now in Sonat and Southern National Gas. Well, Jesse like to have dropped his teeth right there. He was hog-tied for sure, and he knowed it. Well, Jesse said to the boys, now what is this all about? Well, Hired said you done said that twice at Jesse. Walter told Jesse about his epiphany, like he done told him already. Now, Jesse said it was more than that. Well, Buster said they'd talk more on it later on, but right now they had to concentrate on Crow Creek. Jesse knowed he had done been had and had to go along with the boys till it was all over. Jesse did have that much sense, plus he needed a break really. He just was working way too hard. Well, at school, then that lawyer, and then he was doing business for the boys and everything too. When Howard set the Queen down at the Vernal Airport, there was an outfit ready and waiting for him. A four-wheel drive Ford and all the camping gear and a rifle, a shotgun, and the boys' pistols was already in the plane. The boys had also rented rooms at the plaza for a week just in case they needed them. The boys ate a good supper at the ranch, and that's the name of this restaurant there, and stayed over at the plaza the first night. Now the next morning, Buster and Walter had a humdinger of a breakfast at Naples restaurant, and Howard Jesse kind of nibbled as usual. Now folks, these places I'm telling you is real. In fact, I ought to have a room named after me, much as I stayed at that place when we was mining up there. Well, Walter was easing up to Buster about eating. I'm a-telling you. What I mean by that is he pert near catch up to Buster eating as much as he did, but he could never out-eat Buster. Not there yet, but gaining ground. Before long, old Melvin was going to have to holler calf rope when he decided to pile into Walter. Now, Melvin's his brother, the older one. And he was always deviling Walter, if you remember. Walter just wasn't no little feller no more. He's pretty near 6'4" like Buster. Well, after breakfast, the boys headed on out to Crow Creek just to see what all was going to happen with Walter and his dreams. They set up camp, pitched their tent, and hiked all around there. On top of the mountain, they met a feller that just come off the trail in a four-wheel drive Dodge, and he was with another feller that was a mite wall-eyed. The feller stopped and began to visit and introduced himself as Nimrod Ott. And the other feller was Tony. No last name, just Tony. Said they was just enjoying the country and was from these parts, and that's what all the boys was doing there. Well, the boys said they had been there a time or two whilst traveling through and just enjoyed the peace and quiet of the place and come for a few days for a rest up. Well, after a bit, old Ott and Tony left on out. The boys hiked on back to camp. Lo and behold, reckon who's there? Julian. Walter walked up to Julian and told him they was all there just like he said to be. Well, Julian said he knowed they'd be in there and he needed to tell them a story of gold. Well, Julian started to tell with his appreciation of the boys and their spirit. Him and the dog soldiers was sent to ask him to take care of this little piece of business for them. There was just some things the spirit world needed a hand in. Now, you just got to understand, this just wasn't all the work of the good Lord, even though he was the ramrod of it all. But he just allowed some things to go along till he just had to step in. It just wasn't time for him to do that now. So, he is letting it play out like it's going to be and see what all comes out of it. Now, there was some Indians called the Aztecs a good while back. And they got into it with the Spaniards who was trying to take over. They wanted to just conquer them. Anyhow, the Aztecs took their gold and religious doodads and ended up in Utah at Crow Creek. Now, some nefarious type fellers had been after the gold and artifacts for quite a spell and was about to find them and run off with them and melt them all down and sell the lot. Them fellers don't give a hoot what it means to the Indians nor what is represented by the artifacts and the knowledge they possess. Now, the leader of the pack is that feller by the name of Nimrod Ott. Old Nimrod. And his sidekick is a feller by the name of Tony. Now, this here Tony is about the biggest liar a feller would meet. He says he was rich, and then he says he was sold as a baby, and all sorts of nonsense, and most of all, he says he knows where the treasure is. Well, it just so happens these two Nimnuts, they is called that cause of Nimrod, and they are nuts, have been about stumbled on to where the treasure's hid. Now, they got to have some help because they ain't got no money, so you got to look out for them. Now, the powers that want to be here, you all boys, to get the treasure and keep the gold and do good with it, but give the artifacts to the Indians. Now, that's what the dog soldiers and everybody else wanted them to do. Old Black Kettle. Well, there's a little twist to all this, so listen up. You got all kinds of folks in this deal that trying to get the gold artifacts and some technology that was given to the Aztecs by some fellers you don't know about and don't need to right now. The technology will be kept by y'all till I give you the word of what to do with it. This feller, Nimrod Ott, is going to come after you and hit you up for a good piece of change. I want you to go along with it, and Walter is going to record what is said and done with a hidden tape recorder and camera in his pen. Now your friend Dalton is going to slip it to Walter, and he is to just act like he don't know him, and if he sees him, but most probably he won't. Now there's another double crosser going on too with old Nimrod and a feller named Ronald Richkoff. Now there's a pair to draw to. One knows and one thinks he knows. Now like I said, there's going to be some twists and turns, but you just got to keep your eye on the ball and only trust those you know, no matter what. Now boys, I know all the things y'all have done and been through, but this is by far the most important to y'all and the world, heck, the universe. If you need me, I'll be there. Good luck, keep the faith. One other thing, Jesse, a word of caution. Listen to your friends. Well, the next morning, Howard and Walter went back into town and cleaned up a mite at the room and decided to look in on the Queen to make sure she was ready to fly at a moment's notice. Whilst checking over the Queen, Walter spied a pen in the front passenger seat and right off knowed it was the pen he was supposed to use. Danged if that wasn't fast. Well, before Howard and Walter left on out of town, they stopped by the Walmart and picked up a few things they needed at camp, and then headed on back out for the 24-mile drive back to Crow Creek. Well, when they got there, Jesse and Buster was sitting around the campfire talking to guess who? Nimrod and old Tony. Tony was a-lapping up a beer, and Nimrod and Buster and Jesse was a-drinking coffee. Walter and Howard sat on down at the camp table, and Walter took out his new pen and set it down aimed at Nimrod and Tony. Now, Nimrod said howdy to Walter and Howard, and he said they was just in time because they wanted to share a story with them. Now, Nimrod started it off and then told Tony to pick it up from there about the lost treasure of the Uinta Mountains. The Ottism was sure in high gear from then on. Boy, I tell you. First off, after the tale about knowing where the gold was and what all they could do with it, helping the Ute Indians and around here and saving the world, then come the clincher. Now, old Nimrod and his bunch done run out of money and wanted to partner up with the boys if they was interested. Well, Nimrod then reached into his backpack and pulled out 4 gold bars. He said they come from the treasure. Now, how he got them was a story in itself, but he couldn't get them now without anybody's help. He said he got them from some half-Indian that had been in the war and was a drunk but knowed of the gold. Well, Nimrod said he befriended the feller and give him the bars and told him where the gold was in. He said the gold was not quite pure because the Spaniards used lead for bullets and such, and it was like gold to them, so there was only about 60% gold in each bar. Said the bars was sand cast too, and they was rough looking like, and that was why. Well, Tony piped on in and said he done all the research and had maps and drawings and know just where it was. He said they could get it out and have their money inside a month. Well, Nimrod said there was just one problem though. The lady that owned the land just died and it was going to be sold. Nimrod said they just needed to buy the land and the treasure would be theirs. If the boys would put up the money, they would split the treasure 50-50. The boys would get their money back for the land and other expenses first before the split. Well, the boys agreed to that just as Julian told them to. Now, not that they wanted to, I'll tell you, because they knew a wolf in sheep's clothing when they seen him. They're going to try to get conniving. Walter had it all recorded in living color. By the end of the week, the boys had spent $432,000 on the land and started to digging in a tunnel that was supposed to be an old air shaft to the treasure rooms with 5 of Nimrod's men there in the mix of the search. Boy, this looks like a doozy. Well, after a week of tunneling, there wasn't much progress, but several old candles and papers from at least 100 years back was found. The boys all laid off digging till Buster and 3 of their friends come up for a week to help dig and bring in some safety equipment and tools. The boys had been out now going on 3 weeks. All of them called back home and checked in to let everyone know all of them was all right, you know. They said they'd be there for a spell yet, but it looked like it would be done with after a while, and they'd keep in touch. Well, during this time, Jesse done got right smack dab in the middle of this water haul and was helping to set up old Nimrod and his crew. Now, Nimrod wanted the boys to sign up some papers, but Jesse would have had none of it and told Nimrod no dice on that. Another round of digging went on for 10 days and still no access to the treasure. Well, Buster sent his and boys on back home and paid them off. Nimrod did the same with his and men, but don't rightly know about them being paid off, though. Well, Nimrod also had a falling out with Tony and canceled his deal with him. Now, Nimrod come to the boys with more books and maps and treasure sign that said he verified the treasure was there. The boys then brought in a contractor and lots of heavy equipment to dig in different locations. Getting a little expensive, isn't it, folks? A feller with a ground penetrating radar, a feller expert in satellite remote sensing, several fellers with dowsing rods and witching sticks come in too, as well as Ronald Richkoff with his and alien friends on the spaceship to help locate the exact spot to dig for the treasure. Now, I just got to stop here, folks. Now, I told you this was based on truth, and it is. And what I'm telling you is true. Now, there's a little bit of a twitch in there sometime with names and so forth and whatever, but the basis of this story is true. Believe it or not, call me Ripley, but it's true. Well, so far the boys have done about spent $1.5 million and no end in sight. Well, Julian come to the boys one afternoon late evening and told the boys to hang in there because fur was about to fly. Well, old Tony showed up with a crew that come out the woods, and Buster got into a scrap with him and run him off their property. Then every government agency you could think of come in and give the boys a sure enough fit. Of course, old Nimrod was nowheres to be found. Then a bunch of local fellers started shooting up equipment and just being downright a nuisance. Folks from everywhere, it seemed, come on the property thinking it was their right or was BLM land open to the public. BLM is Bureau of Land Management, government. Not so. The boys had the deed and had to get the law to patrol the area to keep them away. Even new locked gates didn't help much. They come in anyways. Jesse had Lamar Green handling the legal matters for him, and the boys even had permanent rooms at the plaza named after them. They'd been there so long, I told you. But the boys was committed. They wasn't going to leave right yet, no matter how long it took. Well, one morning early, Walter come out of the tent and see the whole passel of Indians atop the rise on the east and the west. Now, they didn't do nothing, just rode the ridges on horseback and on four-wheelers. Well, then one day, old Nimrod, he had to come up. Showed up again, right out of the blue with a feller the boys didn't know. Here come oddism, because the story he told was a whopper. Come to find out, Nimrod snookered this feller into investing the right smart of money in the project and a new machine. I don't really know what you call it, but it was a new thing he come up with, he said. Well, Nimrod went to running that machine all over the area where the treasure was supposed to be and finally said he found some coins and beads and give them to Walter. Now, the boys spent a ton of money a digging where Nimrod said to dig, and then when nothing was found, Nimrod finally said it was all over. No treasure was to be found. It was just an investment gone bad. Well, the boys was a little bumfuzzled over that, I tell you, and all of them went to where the snake lodge had been built and built a fire in the dusk of evening and asked for Julian to come to them. Now, as the boys were sitting around the fire, Julian come up behind them and sit right down Indian style and told them it was all about to come to a head. Well, right behind Julian was Dalton. My word, Dalton told the boys just to sit easy, 'cause him and Mr. Hiram Holmes knowed all about Julian and some other things the boys weren't privy to. Now, both Julian and Dalton told the boys there was a message for them, and it was from some folks they know, and it was to hold the line. Boy, that didn't get the hackles coming up on the back of their heads, I'm telling you. Well, the boys knowed they just had to do that, and told Dalton and Julian not to fret none, that they wasn't going nowhere. They'd lay right in there, money, no money, or whatever. Well, the boys had money back in, a little bit. Walter told the boys that they was going into town to find a rat-tail drill. Well, they loaded up, and when they got to their rooms to clean up a mite, there was a feller there with some papers for them. Well, Jesse took the papers for all of them and immediately sent them to Lamar Green. It was a lawsuit from the feller that come with Nimrod, and he was a-wanting the land and what was in it. Well, this was a heck of a twist for sure. That feller didn't have nothing to do with the boys at all. Nimrod and his and them nuts was behind this for sure. That feller wanted all the cake and eat it too, if there was cake, but that wasn't going to happen. Well, Walter found a rat-tail drill and had the man come on out with his and drill to the diggings the next morning. The boys all hunkered down with the feller over coffee and decided to move over 25 foot. Something just didn't sit right with where Nimrod was wanting them to dig. Them aerials and that radar showed a what you call an anomaly, and that is exactly where the boys were going to have that feller drill. Now, the hole would be 36 inches in diameter and would allow a good look-see with a light and a camera. Well, at 51 feet, they hit the cavity. Now, there was a room, sure enough, and some activity had been going on, looked like to them, recent-like. Now, Jesse lowered himself down in that hole and took a gander. He could squeeze in there, a little fella, like it was. There was sure enough evidence that somebody had been in the cave. There was gum wrappers and cigarette butts and skid tracks to prove it. Ain't no Aztecs had them things in their day and time, that's for sure. Well, when Jesse was hauled back up, Injuns was everywhere. They was a hooping and a hollering to beat the band. Rifle fire and arrows was a-flying around like a buzzing from a hive of bees. The boys was in a pickle for sure, and the driller and the boys hunkered down behind the drill and said some mighty serious prayers. They didn't have their guns on them and no way to defend themselves at all. But here come the dog soldiers to the rescue. Now the tussle was on, I'm a-telling you. It give the boys time to get to their guns out the tent and get on into the ruckus. Well, 'tweren't no need. Old Black Kettle and his and men routed them Utes and left a many of them a-laying time it was all over with. These here must be the bad Injuns, Howard said. Sure glad them dog soldiers is on our side. This is the second time they done saved our bacon. Now, Jesse radioed the sheriff to come on out and see the dead and wounded. The driller was interviewed, and he said he didn't see nothing because he was hiding in the tracks under the drill. Now, the sheriff said that the boy sure done some damage to that bunch of hostiles, but where did them arrows come from and Tommyhawks too? There just wasn't a good answer for him, but Dalton had heard the call on the radio and took care of the sheriff along with Mr. Holmes. That part was cleared up in a hurry. Now, Dalton said that some traitors in the government, namely from DARPA and the Pentagon, had stole the gold and the technology that had to be recovered. Them fellers was in league with a bunch he just couldn't let the boys know about yet. Well, that didn't last long. About that time, the clouds began to dissipating and fireworks was going off all across the sky. Richkoff come running up about that time, too, and hollered he wasn't no part of Nimrod, and there was going to be hells a-popping right about now. Now, Dalton bulldogged Richkoff and hollered for the driller to lower them all into the treasure cave. Now, all the little fellers and mediums like Walter went right on in with no problem. Dalton stayed up on top and was helping Buster get down when him and Buster just disappeared. Poof! Richkoff said the general of the Intergalactic Federation must have saved him from the blast. Heck, everything went haywire. GPS and watches and cameras and cell phones went crazy. The cell phones fried, the watches went backwards, the GPS showed a mile and a half off, and cameras wouldn't work. What the dickens was going on, said Hired. Well, Jesse told Hired he had an idea and snatched up Richkoff and told him to spill the beans. Whew, now Jesse could get right fractious sometimes, and that sometimes was now. Now Richkoff told Jesse and Hired that there was a technology that was given to the Aztecs a few hundred years ago, and whoever had it could pretty near rule the world. Now Hired asked Richkoff who give it, and what world was he talking about? Boy, I know y'all think I'm crazy, but we've talked to some folks. Richkoff and his said this world and alien beings from another world and another dimension. Well, boy, that's about all they could take, I guess, but they had to listen to it. Now, this was sure enough Buck Rogers stuff and awful hard to swallow, but the proof was in the pudding. Well, Buster and Dalton was gone, and all hell was breaking loose topside. The driller just fainted dead away, not to be a bother to nobody. Better that way, Richkoff said. Poor feller was some scared to death. It seemed like an eternity, but Dalton and Buster was beside him in just a few minutes. Well, Hired hollered to Buster, "How in the devil did you get down here?" Buster said to Hired he needed to watch Star Trek for the answer to that, he reckoned. Oh, man, he just didn't rightly know. Well, whilst they was all down in the treasure cave, Dalton set them all down and commenced a confab. Palavering first off, ain't no mention of this, none of this, ever to be told. Richkoff, your hide is iron now, and one wrong move, and you'll be dealt with by our friend Devane. Well, Richkoff told Dalton he just didn't know who was who, and that's why he was so secretive. Dalton said they had his number for years, but now the fat was in the fire, and he had to make a little trip to see Mr. Holmes before this was all over with. Boy. Well, Richkoff said that was no problem. He welcomed the opportunity to see Mr. Holmes. Well, if he did or if he didn't, he was going to see Mr. Holmes, and he better be straight or he was a goner. Well, Hired, Walter, Buster, and Jesse knowed for a fact that to be true, and knowed Mr. Holmes would do what was best for the U.S. of A. Now, Dalton said to Buster if he didn't mind, would he tote the driller out the cave, just follow him. Poor feller. Dead to rights, but he was not really dead. He was just out cold. They all come out the cave from the northwest tunnel, and they was a fur piece from the camp, though. Well, Buster set the driller down and got some water from a trickle of a spring coming out the mountain and wetted down the driller's face. He come to just a blubber. Buster calmed him down and told him he just had a little knock on the head. They told him that the sheriff come and all the fracas was over. Well, that driller shook his and hayed and just didn't get to where they was and how they got there, but Dalton said they had to hightail it out of there after the shooting started. They was safe now and going back to camp. They done just that, and the driller packed up and went home. Well, Walter paid the man and thanked him for his good work. The feller said if they ever needed a hole drilled, that he was retired. Oh, boy, I remember that. Their drilling was way too much drama and just too much for a feller's heart to take. Well, Dalton told Richkoff to take on off and got where he would be the next day and to expect him or someone to fetch him. Dalton told him he better be there or else now. Richkoff said he sure enough would be. Now, before Richkoff left out, he told Dalton that he heard a name one time whilst Nimrod was a-talking, quiet like on the phone. Nimrod didn't know he could hear him. The name was Laney. Dalton nodded and said he'd see him tomorrow. Then Dalton commenced to tell the boys about what all was going on. But before the story was told, Dalton called up Mr. Holmes on the sat phone so they could hear what he had to say first. Well, Mr. Holmes got on the line and Dalton put it on speaker so all the boys could hear. Seems like Nimrod was a double and triple crossing everybody. But he didn't know what he knowed about all of it for sure, because he was just a pawn in the scheme of things. Now, Mr. Holmes didn't want the boys in on all of what was happening, but it got plumb out of hand, so many factions in the mix trying to get the upper hand. Now, here's the lay of the land, as Mr. Holmes told it. Now, old Nimrod and his Nimnuts friends was trying to not only get the gold, but the ancient technology from a group of aliens from the days of the Aztecs. It was really passed down to them from other tribes, but the Aztecs got plumb savage with their sacrifices and all. Now, that's why the Spaniards were led on to the gold they had and why they attacked them. The technology didn't mean nothing to the Spaniards, but it was the gold, and that was what they wanted. The Aztecs come from down Mexico and South America way, with the Spaniards following them. There was one heck of a battle in southern Utah, and the Aztecs got away to where the portal was. Portal. There are several portals on the land that the boys bought. It was here they hid the treasure with the help of the technology, and they was massacred later on when the Spaniards caught up to them. The Utes was bought off to help them, and the battle was really over before it even started. Then the Mormons got into the act by the way of the Utes. Now, they was a different breed of skunk. They could be meaner than a snake and found out about the technology and wanted to be the head knocker in the world. But the Utes moved most everything, but not all the gold. Well, the new HARP system could penetrate 1,000 feet in the earth and found the treasure and the technology. Now, Mr. Holmes had complete control over the whereabouts of the treasure, but one feller that worked on the satellite surveillance was bought off by the bad guys in the government. They all wanted all the power that the technology would give them, and that is where Nimrod was useful by way of Lane E. Nimrod thought he could outfox everybody and get at least half the gold in possession of the technology by way of a deal with the boys. But there was some more players in the game now. Excuse me. There was the original aliens that give the technology to the Indians that was really descendants of Noah by way of the connected continents a long ways back. I know it's a lot to swallow, folks, but here tell, that's what these folks say. They wanted to get it back before the black-hearted and evil, the likes the world ain't never seen, got it. They was a bunch from their dimension that wanted to control the universe. Now, there are several universes, and this was to be their first one to conquer. That was all the fireworks you seed in the sky. The good guys won that round and saved the day. Now, all that had to be done was to rid the country of the traitors and move on. Now, Mr. Holmes said to remember what Julian told them all. The Ramrod was just going to see how it all played out till he stepped in. And I reckon you know who the Ramrod is. Well, it was so. He didn't have to. The people he counted on came through. He said, now boys, we've been through some times here and again, but this one was the most important fracas ever. Secrecy ain't even close here. You're looking at 6 people in the world that knows what all went on. I'm the only one that knows it all and can't tell all of it. The speed of trust between us is paramount for not only you and your families, but your country and the world as we know it. Well, Julian and them dog soldiers, they come from somewhere, and y'all know it. You're living proof of that some kind of power had blessed you and kept you breathing. We both know that. Some questions you can ask, and some you can't. Any questions now? Well, all the boys to a man sat there a question, and they could be counted on for the secret till their dying day. Iron word is iron bond. Good enough, said Mr. Holmes. Now, Mr. Holmes said he knowed that, and others did too before this all started. He was right proud of him. Carry on, Dalton. Goodbye, boys. Thank you. And that's what he said before he hung up. Dalton said it's what it is and it ain't over with yet. They all went on back to camp, and camp was broke, and the boys got their belongings and headed back into town to the plaza. Well, Dalton met the boys that evening, and they all went to supper at the new Mexican restaurant there on the outskirts of town. Well, all the boys and Dalton, too, had a margarita. The food was real good, and all of them ate their fill. Well, Dalton told the boys to head on back home in the morning and stay put till him or Mr. Holmes called them. Well, all the boys, but Jesse spoke up first. Said they would be ready and awaiting for one of them to call them. The next morning, the boys dropped off all their gear in the four-wheel drive at the airport and paid the rental company their bill. Their flight was uneventful back home, but the conversation was quite lively, I tell you. The boys couldn't help but wondering and speculating between themselves about all the carrying on they'd been through. Walter looked out the window at the sky and the mountains and the ground below and told the boys that only one thing made all that. That's God. Well, all the boys was quiet for a spell as they was contemplating what Walter done said. Buster put the Queen on autopilot and said to the boys that he didn't rightly see how they all got to be where they was, but they was chose for this a long time ago, he reckoned. He figured he had a choice in the matter, but was sure glad he done took the right trail. All of them agreed to that. Next, Buster said he had something to say to Jesse and wanted Jesse to take it like a man, like it was meant. Jesse said not to bust a gut, cousin, get her to say it. Well, Jesse, you got your hay turned summers, but not the right way when it come to that black-headed gal and her sisters and her crowd. They ain't never gonna do nothing but do you misery. That black-headed girl, Janice, whatever her name was, knows you got money and knows your shortcomings. She ain't for nobody but herself. She don't care one whit about you nor nobody else. Now, cuz I see three of the best women in the world that love you dearly, and this one ain't one of them. We all know you ain't ready to settle down quite yet, but you got blinders on now. Well, Jesse piped up and said they was just friends. Walter and Hired hollered at Jesse that if you got friends like that, you don't need no enemies. Well, Buster went on to say that the gals and Jesse's ma and pa done some investigating. They didn't want to get in your business, but your hide and heart was at stake here, and they love you and they don't want no harm to come to you, plus they got lots invested in you, boy. Jesse, this just has to be said. So don't go getting all riled at me and the boys or the gals or any of the folks. We know you'd do the same for us if and we was a nuts like the ones we've been dealing with. Oh, the gal and all her people are just gold diggers. They'd do anything for money. Buster said, Jesse, just let me ask you a question. Have you give any money to that Janice gal or any of her kin for any reason? Well, Jesse just hung his and hayed and took a deep breath and said, yep, enough said. I'm just telling you that I got word at the plaza what all them people has done, and you sure wouldn't put up with none of that. Well, then Jesse went on to tell the boys how it all come about. And now he didn't love that gal none, but kind of felt sorry for her and her people. She and her sisters always helped him out with some business and school matters when he was overloaded. They all kind of run together and they was fun, and he was treated like he was one of them. He was a mite lonely at school and plumb wore to a frazzle too. Jesse admitted that he'd seen how they treated other boys and the nasty things they said about them, and he knowed they was good fellers but just didn't have no money. Jesse said he seen where they would take all a feller had and move on to another. He didn't like that so much, but they always had an excuse for their actions. Well, Jesse told the boys he was sorry and appreciated them taking care of him when he wasn't seeing straight. Well, Hired said, Jesse, tomorrow is another day, and there is more important things to consider than a woman with no conscience. Lesson learned. Walter said, Jesse, little Annette said she's got a surprise awaiting for you. By the way, the gal said if you couldn't handle that black-hated gal, they'd be more than happy to do it for you. Boy, all of them laughed on that one. Now, all the boys knowed what them gals could do when they got riled. When they landed, Buster's Ford was there at the airstrip waiting for him to get home. Now, Walter had called the house when they stopped to refuel and knowed what all was going to happen. Well, all the boys piled on into Buster's Ford and went on over to the McBrayers. Jesse's birthday was September 14th, and that was today. When they all walked into the house, it was already dark. When Jesse opened the door, a whole passel of folks jumped up and hollered, surprise, surprise, happy birthday, Jesse. Well, old Jesse was plumb flabbergasted and disconfobulated. The first one to Jesse was his and Ma, and then his and Pa shook his and hand. After that, the crowd kind of parted, and a vision of pure loveliness stood there in front of Jesse. It was Monique. Jesse knew right then and there where his heart was, and that he knowed what direction he was going in when he settled in, if and she'd wait for him. Well, everybody had a high old time, and the old McBrayer was a flowing real free like. Of course, all the women folk kept their eyes peeled on the boys and their paws. They didn't want none of the men folk getting too frisky, you know. Well, Grandpa Gus was a cutting a rug in a waltz and then a polka and having a ball a dancing with Grandma. The band was some fellers from town, and after a bit, Buster handed Jesse his and fiddle. Reckon nary a word was said and a person stirred while he played a song for Monique, Howard and Alma May, Walter and Luann, and Buster and Lulu. Time that was over, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Monique got up and kissed old Jesse till the boy about turned blue. Before she turned him loose, she whispered to him that she loved him and would be a-waiting if and he wanted her. Well, Jesse got a bit teary-eyed and smiled as he told her to wait. He'd be round in a bit. Well, after that, Jesse got all the boys' folks out in the middle of the dance floor and played a special tune for the folks. All the boys gathered round Jesse, arm in arm, and began to sing to the tops of their lungs. Now, of course, Buster was a caterwauling, but nobody noticed. The rest of the folks there joined in, and Jesse turned the music back over to the band. Well, Buster hollered for everybody's attention. He said that somebody here might have thought they was forgot, but he wasn't. There is another feller here that has a birthday today, September the 14th. Howard, just look up in the sky. Well, the whole passel of folks at the party went to looking out the windows and running outside for a look-see. Now, Buster grabbed a hold of Howard and told him to take a gander up there pointing to the sky. There was a flyover by the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels and the Golden Knights paratroopers. About that time, a whole passel of folks that had worked and flown with Howard come in along with Mr. Holmes, Dalton, Devane, Horace, and Alfred. Then a special guest come in and was needing no introduction. The President of the United States of America presented Howard with his wings in the United States Air Force, along with another set of wings, chicken wings they called them. Howard was made a full colonel in the United States Air Force. Howard was just plumb flabbergasted, speechless. Well, Buster slapped him on the back and said it looked like he was going to have to talk for the boy. Well, Howard spoke up and said, not this time. Howard saluted the President and then thanked everybody for them a-thinking of him. Well, Big Jim and Shirley, along with Alma May, was just a-beaming. All the boys gathered around Howard and began to shake his hand. Now, Mr. Holmes presented Howard with a plaque and certificate signed by him and the President for his service and contribution to the U.S. of A. and advancement in the field of aeronautics. Now, all the folks stayed late after all the people left on out and discussed what all had happened whilst they was gone. The boys just up and flat out told their folks they couldn't tell them all about it, and the folks knowed Mr. Holmes had something to do with all that, and it's okay. They'd been there with him before, knowed he was doing right about all of them, and they had the speed of trust. It was going on about 2 weeks when Dalton called and asking if the boys could fly on up to Washington to visit Mr. Holmes, Mr. Hiram. They said they'd be there tomorrow afternoon. Well, when the boys landed, Dalton picked them up and carried them to Mr. Hiram's office. They all got seated and was introduced to a feller that Mr. Hiram said was a federal prosecutor by the name of Tom McSwain. Mr. McSwain told the boys he had a few questions and asked if and Walter had the Camry with the recordings on it and if and Jesse had the land papers. They give them to Mr. McSwain, and then he told them that he already been in touch with Lamar Green. There wasn't no more lawsuit from that Peckerwood from California that was with them nuts Nimrod. He'd been dealt with. Nimrod's autism done caught up with him. Mr. McSwain was a prosecuting Nimrod Ott for so many charges he'd be lucky to count them all if he lived to be 1,000. The government took all of his possessions and business and said he was lucky not to be hanged. Old Nimrod give up all the dastardly deeds he done, and the folks he was in league with to steal and swindle. Nimrod got life without parole in the bargain, or it was a hanging. Presidential Corps people took care of the traitors under the direction of Devane. The feller that betrayed Mr. Holmes had it go hard on him, treason. The others in the Pentagon and DARPA weren't too lucky neither. They just disappeared. Well, Mr. Holmes told the boys that they was to buy a bank, and what bank to buy. It was really already done. It was a bank down in New Orleans that had an original French charter that went under, and the boys got it for that. There wasn't going to be no depositors, and the boys could issue their own credit cards and loan to other banks if they wanted to. It was a right safe place for gold, he said. The boys looked at him all quizzical-like and said, "What gold?" Then he told the boys that the gold recovered and put there for 'em in that bank must be well over $1 billion apiece. The 160 acres was to be in the boys' names. That was theirs to handle with Julian's direction when he visited. Mr. Holmes held up his hand and said, "No questions. He'll come sooner or later. Old Julian always show up." The artifacts was to be distributed to the right Indians and museums, so everybody was happy. But the technology, said Walter, where did it go? Well, Mr. Hiram Holmes looked over his glasses at the boys and Dalton and simply said, "The world is now safe." The boys left out for home right away and decided to get the gals and run on down to New Orleans way to see the bank and see what over $4 billion worth of gold looked like. Well, Jesse called Monique and asked her to meet up with him there, and they'd stay for a few days. Since she didn't have to work now, thanks to the boys, and was going to school at Tulane, she had the time. Her pa had his heart surgery and was doing fine, and all was getting on back to normal. Pierre was given some money to start up a crawfish, we call them crawdads, farm, and was doing good too. Monique and Jesse had them a real good sit-down conversation and come to terms. Like Grandpa Gus says, a good understanding makes good friends. Walter also said the end was in the beginning, and if Howard said if and the thing starts off wrong, it'll end up wrong. Well, Jesse and Monique are off on the right foot and are moving on. She really does understand old Jesse and will make a good partner one day when he's ready. Well, Jesse got on back to the lawyering school after Christmas break, and the first person he seed was that black-headed girl, Janice, and her sisters. She was a gushing over Jesse like there was no tomorrow. Well, Jesse said, "Hold up there," and pulls out one of them newfangled phone projectors that was a prototype that Leonard and Bill give him that was in their R&D department. There was pictures and records and documents and all the proof a body would need to convict a lying, conniving no-count. When Jesse turned the projector off, he told Janice and her sisters not to ever come near him again. Plus, they and her people owed him money, and he would see to it he collected. A Mr. Tom McSwain would be in touch. Well, so there you have it. All's well that ends well. Well, Jesse didn't know it, but Buster was there doing his job of watching. He was the senior executive assistant. Now, y'all have a blessed day, and we'll get back to another story real soon. Goodbye now.